Welcome back. You're watching Credlin. Well, today at 10 o'clock, Victoria's independent inquiry into the state's failed hotel quarantine system commenced. Today, there was a number of people putting forward commentary. Tony Neal, QC, was there. We're told that this inquiry will get to the bottom of what's wrong with Victoria's arrangements. The arrangements that have seen the state, of course, have, in its second wave outbreak, a far worse outcome than it had in the first wave back in March and April. To date, the Premier, ministers and health officials have all refused to answer media questions about the hotel quarantine failures, they say, because of this inquiry. They call it sub judice. They say we can't answer questions now in the media because it will prejudice the inquiry. But will it? There are real questions that not only does the inquiry lack the powers it needs to be a true judicial inquiry, but also that some of the politicians not answering the questions now hampers our chances in Victoria of remedying any faults when we use quarantine before we get that report back in September. Someone who well understands how a proper inquiry ought to operate is Dr. Matthew Collins, QC. He joins me now from Melbourne. Dr. Collins, thank you very much for your time. Let's start on the whole question of sub judice. The Minister, the Premier, others saying, well, we can't answer questions in the media because we don't want to prejudice this inquiry. Is that fair?
Well, look, we have rules of sub judice contempt, which are all about avoiding prejudice to the administration of justice. But they're rules that typically apply in the criminal justice or just the justice system more generally. So take, for example, someone who's facing criminal charges. You know, it would be a contempt for the Herald Sun or the Daily Telegraph or you to report their prior convictions because that could prejudice the ability of the accused to get a fair trial. And you can have contempt of royal commissions and boards of inquiry, but not in the same way because there's no risk of prejudicing a jury here. Instead, the commissioner is a highly respected retired judge who obviously would be independent from those kinds of influences.
I'm interested in your comment on the point, and I think it goes to a discussion in the Herald Sun about this today. We've got a situation where there's been quite legitimate concerns about how hotel quarantine was run in Victoria. That system was stopped, incoming flights have now been diverted, but the quarantine process is being used still in Victoria for people that are already here. And of course, it's now being run by Corrections Victoria. And we know in the last couple of days, the police have been involved. How can they be sure that this system is any better than they were operating if they're not prepared to tell us what went wrong in the first place? And if the government itself says we won't know what we need to fix until we get the Commissioner's report in September, how can we even operate a system if no one's prepared to admit what went wrong?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, Peter, for people outside Melbourne. You and I are in Melbourne. We know just how desperate things are here at the moment. You know, I've been in the CBD today. It's basically a ghost town. You know, shops are shut. People are crying out for answers. I think at one level, Peter, you've got to give Dan Andrews credit for calling a board of inquiry because he's got no way of knowing what the outcome is going to be, and you know, it could very well be politically very embarrassing for him. You can understand as a politician his desire to control the narrative at the time being, but weighed against that is, I think, you know, the really legitimate questions that members of the Victorian community and the community in the rest of Australia, for that matter, are asking, because no one wants to find themselves in the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. You know, our freedoms have been very dramatically curtailed, and God forbid it should spread to other parts of Australia. So I think we're balancing the question of the politicians' desire to control the narrative on the one hand with the public's really legitimate desire to have answers on the other.
And confidence that the quarantine system that they're using now has been remedied in a way that we don't have the same effects that we've seen for the last few months. That's my concern. If they were putting hotel quarantining into abeyance and not touching it again till September, till they get this report and they know what went wrong, that would be one thing. But the whole quarantine process is ongoing. So how can you have a system quarantine in place that they say now is safe when they won't admit what went wrong in the first place? That's the problem I've got.
Can I put a political question to you, Peter? You know this much better than I do. What would your advice be if you were advising the head of a state government that found themselves in the position that Dan Andrews is in? Do you call a board of inquiry and then wait for it to deliver its results, or do you seek to provide information constantly as the inquiry gets underway? It's an interesting political position, isn't it?
Well, no, I think he would know. He would be derelict in his duty right now if he did not know what on earth had gone wrong. If for the last 4 or 5 months, when the system has broken down, you can't tell me that the guy running the state is not asking questions of his senior bureaucrats and ministers as to where were the holes in the net, what went wrong, how do we get to the situation where, as we saw with the chief medical officer in Victoria, he can't rule out, Brett Sutton, that there is not a genomic link between every single failed case of quarantine, hotel quarantine, and the current outbreak in Victoria. There is real concerns that they all come from hotel quarantine failures. So I don't understand why the Premier isn't out there saying, look, at least this is what we know. I now have an inquiry into all the broader questions, but we have immediate concerns. I mean, I've got to ask you another legal question. We're told this inquiry won't have the powers to compel documents or witnesses. Surely that's a deficiency.
They're really important features of any independent, transparent inquiry, because what you want is to be assured that people are cooperating fully, providing all of the relevant documents and giving totally honest evidence for fear of the consequences of not doing so. So I agree, they are fundamental characteristics of a transparent, independent inquiry.
So we saw early last week, Monday or Tuesday I think it was, a whole series of emails linked where parts of the public service warned other parts of the public service that unless you had police involved in hotel quarantine it would be deficient. So if you haven't got the power to compel evidence outside, this external inquiry, you can't compel evidence from the public service. How is that going to come to light other than leaks in newspapers?
Leaks are not a satisfactory way of dealing with something as serious as this, because you can never be sure that the leak is complete or in context or telling the whole story. You know, the advantage of a properly constituted Board of Inquiry or Royal Commission with broad terms of reference is that it's the most powerful administrative inquiry mechanism known to our system. And when you think about, the really great inquiries in Australian history that have absolutely changed the course of our country, things like most recently the Hayne Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in institutions, of which, by the way, retired Judge Coates was one of the commissioners, or the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody Royal Commission. These are all Royal Commissions that have gotten to the bottom of problems in a way that has improved Australia. We're in the fight of our lives here in Victoria at the moment, and it would be doing a disservice to the people of Victoria if this Board of Inquiry could not get to the bottom of what's gone wrong.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Collins.